we'll go ahead and get started today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Semantic Data Governance for GDPR Compliance. I would like to start by introducing you to today's speakers. We have Jack Spivak, who is a semantic solutions architect with TopQuadrant. We also have Natasa Veritimo, who is a semantic data modeler with TopQuadrant. In today's webinar, Jack will begin with an overview introducing GDPR requirements and the steps needed for implementing them. Then Natasa will demonstrate capabilities that TopBraid EDG provides for ensuring GDPR compliance. So just a few logistical items before we get started today. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along by using your GoToWebinar controls. To post questions, look on the right-hand side control panel. You should see a drop-down box for questions. If you click on the box, you should be able to post your question at any time during the presentation, and we will address as many of those as time allows at the conclusion of today's webinar. We will also include a few polling questions throughout the presentation and appreciate any feedback from you. We'll also be recording today's webinar, and we'll send a link to the recorded version. With that, I will hand it over to Jack to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Christy. And I guess let's move right into today's program about semantic data governance and GDPR. A few words about TopQuadrant. Most important is that we believe that capturing the meaning of information is essential, and our strong commitment to standards-based approaches to data semantics is what makes this possible. Our mission simply is to make enterprise information meaningful. And today's webinar will be describing how technologies for managing meaningful relationships in enterprise information can help speed and ensure compliance with GDPR. We work with many large clients and government agencies, and we bring substantial experience and approaches that help build enterprise infrastructure to meet regulatory requirements. Our systems are used in many sectors: oil and gas, manufacturing, medicine, life sciences, and financial services are an especially significant focus area for us recently because of the increasing complexity of compliance requirements. As Christy mentioned, I'm going to start with a few words about GDPR. And because we have a rather mixed audience, some of you might be hearing about this for the very first time, and others are already deeply involved in the details of their own compliance programs. I'm going to take a moment to get us on the same page. Fact is, we all have personal information that we share. We leave our digital fingerprints, our preferences, and life stories really everywhere that we travel on our computers and mobile devices. The General Data Protection Regulations adopted by the European Commission protect us from unintentional and intentional misuse of personally identifiable information. GDPR is a broad and a complex mandate, and these regulations in general apply to the personal data of all EU residents and companies. GDPR requires systems to find, to protect, track, audit, and assess the security of personal information, and full compliance by May of 2018. There are 7 overarching principles that guide consent, fairness, accuracy, and accountability to establish what's really a standard of care for personal data. System integrators, law firms, consultants, and others have said a lot about this, and it's making news. There are great references available, but in this webinar, we hope to add something really quite unique and valuable to the conversation. I want to share how current technology in knowledge graph representation and semantic data governance can help to solve the genuinely hard problems in GDPR compliance. Natasa will be demoing several examples of this in TopBraid EDG, our semantic data governance solution. And GDPR is not something we can ignore. There are very severe financial penalties are possible, but worse, violations can put your entire business model at risk, enforcement actions can prohibit processing the very data that drives revenues. And before we dig into this complexity, I'm going to ask Christy's help just to get a sense of where we are as a group on GDPR roadmaps. Christy?
Great, thank you, Jack. If you'll go ahead and publish the poll, we would like to just have a better understanding, as Jack just mentioned, of what stage you're in with understanding and complying with GDPR.
Sure.
So if you'll just take a second and look at your screen, thanks, Jack, and select one of the following. Are you just becoming aware of GDPR? Do you understand the applicability and scope for your company? Are you researching and planning how to comply with GDPR? Evaluating processes and tools to assist in complying, or in the process of implementing those tools? So we'll just give another couple of seconds. Votes are coming in. Okay, Jack, I think you could go ahead and publish those results.
Okay, Christy, can you see them?
Yep, there you go. So they're actually pretty across the board. So some are just becoming aware, where several of you are in the process of evaluating and implementing tools. So very interesting. Thank you for taking that time. Jack, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay. Complying with GDPR is hard because personal information is complex and it touches every level of very complex businesses. Here's one example of why. There's an enormous variety in the types of personal data, the roles in which we generate it, and where it's found. Another reason this is difficult lies in the complexity of the questions we need to answer for GDPR. And with varying perspectives, different users need to know different things. Even more difficult, there's multiple levels, from individual data to entire systems involved in this complexity, and unknowns to design for, with evolving regulations, new data offerings, and new partnering models. We may never make this simple, but we know we have to make it simpler to reduce the costs of complying and the risks of failure. So we get that it's complex, but even this complexity really doesn't capture the whole picture. And I'm going to talk now about what is it that's really so hard about data protection and about how we can solve these hard problems. The hard part is that the complexity is not just about the data. Much more significantly, it's about the flow of the data and the situations into which the flowing data finds itself. GDPR regulations apply differently in different situations. We need a simple answer, but it's not about finding the data and locking it up. We need to be able to address or talk about a chain of relationships, because GDPR compliance is not just about the data, it's all about how things are related and where the data flows. In this simple example you see here, we can see how relationships connect the personal data on the left, like a column about customer names, to processes like software executables, and into situations like here it's being transported, for example, outside the EU, all the way to the specific regulations about that transport. And technology exists that makes discovering this chain of relationships easier. Knowledge graph-based data representation is a technology that represents both your data and chains of relationships like these. Now, I want to emphasize that simple chains are rarely enough to represent networks of relationships and accountabilities. Personal information requires us to track many patterns of regulatory relationships with many different types of regulated things. Knowledge graph representations allow that. And even more important, these graphs enable us to manage unknown complexity by simply adding new things in relationships easily. Because when new regulations or new partners suddenly appear, these new connections expose PII and impact compliance. If you already understand graphs, please bear with me as I take just a moment for a high-level overview of how we capture this meaning, and I promise I'll get back to the practical detail of how we actually do this in TopBraid EDG in a moment. Knowledge graphs tame complexity by making relationship as important as the things that they connect, and by making both of these machine readable. You saw that multiple things and relationships describe a path from personal information to regulations. Graphs are just extended networks of these things and relationships. TopBraid Edge uses relationships in pre-built graphs to directly capture the meaning and the information needed for GDPR compliance. Well, why do we care so much about relationship? It's because knowing all of what relates to our situations is exactly what allows us to understand the actions needed for compliance and whether or not we've taken them. This is really important. Graphs allow us to talk precisely about how personal information is connected and about what this means. Graph-based data representations help tame all of this complexity because they are about relationship. Well, in these relationships, what do we need to talk about? A lot. There are actions in which personal data is involved, and there are obligations to consider. And these are just a few examples of the activities that GDPR regulates. These must be understood and governed. Any GDPR compliance system must be designed to track and account for how personally identifiable information relates to each of these activities. Again, it's all about relationships. So how do we do that? This is where semantic knowledge graphs come in. Semantics is about capturing meaning to make it available for good decision making, simply and flexibly, just like ordinary sentences. Semantics describes the things that we care about and how they relate to each other. Things and relationships. The meaning lives, or we could say is captured in the relationships. It's just like language. And in fact, it actually is language, and having a common language makes communication possible. Semantic standards are a common language for this communication. And today, as a result of a 15-year effort by the W3C, a collection of standards enable the capture and communication of the meaning needed for GDPR compliance. How? These W3C standards stack together in a system that allows us to say things, to share a common vocabulary for saying them, to meaningfully organize what we're saying, to be able to ask about what's been said, and finally, to be able to verify all of this with rules. The standards afford data portability, interoperability, collaboration, and consistency for GDPR compliance. And this is really good because GDPR actually requires data portability. So that's as much of an overview as I can share in the short time about how these really capable technologies enable the compliance in general. And this is another good spot to pause. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Christy, for another quick poll.
Okay, thanks, Jack. As Jack has given you a high-level overview of graph representations, we'd like to know how familiar you are with graph representations and their capabilities. So Jack, if you'll share that, thank you. Select one of the following. Are you familiar? Are you not familiar? Have you heard of them but want to know more? Do you understand their applicability and benefits? You're already exploring their use, or you currently work with them and know their capabilities? You'll take a second to answer. We'll share those results. And Jack, I think you could go ahead and close out the poll and share.
Okay, Christy, can you see them again?
Yeah, I can see them. So seems like most of you have heard of them. And a lot of you are exploring and already working with graph representations, which is great. So thank you for taking that time. And Jack, I'll let you move on.
All right, thanks, Christy. I promised to get back to the detail of how TopBraid Edge uses these graph representations and semantic standards in GDPR compliance. And I'm privileged to be on the team tackling exactly this problem at TopQuadrant. In TopBraid Edge, we created a pre-built foundational standardized set of graph representations so that you don't have to. In this example, you can see a small segment of a graph representing the complexity of regulation and regulatory compliance concepts in general. You see things like the types of regulations, articles of law stipulating them, regulated parties, regulated activities, like that. And here, similarly, is an excerpt from a GDPR regulations and GDPR concepts in particular. GDPR is more specific, so you see more specific things like the notion of a GDPR regulated process and a GDPR regulated data activity. And this is where the rubber meets the road. You can see that these conceptual graphs are actually built into the TopBraid Edge product and available for use, as Natasha is going to be showing you next. Finally, you've seen two graphs. This third graph, a governance graph, we represent the relationships necessary to connect your own enterprise information, processes, policies, and resources to the various regulatory and GDPR graphs. And so what that looks like is that we use the power of TopBraid Edge to bring all of this together into a connected knowledge base that can be queried for insights, reports, and decision support. We're about to go into the demo. So one last slide to help orient you. And this slide is a bit complex. You don't have to read it all now. That's the substance of the demo. If you focus just on these blue boxes for a moment, all you have to remember is how complex chains of connection can be followed all the way from the first, the data elements over on the left, through second, the situations that involve them, to third, the regulatory obligations that govern these situations, all the way to the fourth, the actual text of the law that stipulates the regulations. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Jack. And let me start by giving you an overview of our environment in features that concern GDPR. What you see here is the homepage of TopBraid Edge. Edge is an agile data governance environment where you can centralize the collections and distribution of the different types of your organization assets. And you can see collections of assets here on your left. Every organization that is interested in GDPR has obviously to gather and describe its data asset. You cannot protect something that you cannot see. So here in data asset collections, you can describe all your data elements, your databases, tables, columns, views, logical models. And let's see a list of data assets here. And let me click in one. And we can see here, for example, a database column. This is a database column, it says so. And this column is column of a database table, and this table is table of a database. So here on the top, you can see a list of all the different data asset types that you can use to describe your data assets. For example, you see relation databases, data warehouses, but you can also use, as we said, data assets to describe your logical models, the entities and the attributes, and how this maps to the tables and columns in the physical databases. Let me go back to Edge. And here in technical assets, we describe everything that has to do with infrastructure, all the software executables, the servers, the transformation, the mapping, store procedures, triggers. And for GDPR compliance, you need to know all this, but you also need to know how the data flows in the software executables. Let's see an example. Let's take this Java program, for example. Okay, so we see that in this Java program, we have some inputs, and these are database columns, as we saw before, and the output is a data set in a report. And we also see what business function this application supports. Now, let me go back to Edge, and let's go to Enterprise Assets, where we capture the information about your business activities, the functions, the processes, the roles. In GDPR, you need to know the purpose of the use of your data, for which business activity it's being used. And let's see an example here. For example, we have a business activity that is marketing, and that has another sub-activity to engage a Norwegian firm. For this business function, we probably supply reports that are produced by applications, as we saw before, and these applications have input data columns, as we saw at the beginning. So all these collections are connected together, as Jack also described. And today, we will focus in compliance assets here and show you how all this interconnected data from the different assets can be used to identify compliance with different regulations, and today it would be for GDPR. Compliance assets are all about regulations, forms, procedures, and documents that you might need. For our demo today, we will use an example compliance asset named TopBank Corp, which brings together datasets that you can find in the banking domain. And let's go into our production copy. I will try to describe our GDPR features based on our user story. Let's suppose that I'm the data protection officer, and I have a data element that contains personal identifiable information. This data element can be a column, but it can be a report column in a report, or in a logical model. For today's story, we'll say that we want to mark as PII a database column, and let's say that I want to mark as PII customer name, for example, from table customer. Okay, so what I have to do is go into the edit button, press the edit button, and here I see all the information that I have available to describe a database column. So one of the information, one of the properties, as we say, says personal, if this database column is personal identifiable information, and I will put that to true. I probably have to put a criticality level here if I want to. I want you to notice that I don't just type that, and it's not a simple text, a simple string. I take it from a control vocabulary, and later on we will explain what's the importance of control vocabularies. And let me also put a general, but again, I want to explain the different kind of personal data categories and why you should care about them. Different obligations in GDPR derive from different categories. So for example, the biometric and genetic data are subject to more stringent conditions. So it's better if you put the category here. So let me, for today, let's pick general data category. I think I have enough and I can save. I could put the encryption method here, but I won't do that because the encryption method, some information like the encryption method, you shouldn't have it in the data level, but you should have it as the data flows into some of your processes. So I will explain that a little bit later. So for now, I'll just save my changes. So I saved already. I have marked my database column as PII. However, this is not enough. Up until now, we have covered what many GDPR practitioners call the bottom-up approach, where we have described all our data elements, metadata around them. We have marked which ones are personal identifiable information, PII, and we have put relevant properties for GDPR. However, the same data can be used in different applications and for different purposes. So they will be under different GDPR obligations. So we also need to have the top-down approach. We need to identify the processes that my data participate in. For example, you see here that my customer name database column is input in several applications. We need to know for what purpose do they participate? Where does these processes take place and who is accessing it? In short, in GDPR compliance, the obligations depend on the situation that my data finds itself in. It depends on what we call situated process. And let's navigate to see what is a situated process. So here we see some situated processes, and one of them involves our database column customer name. Now, how was this situated process created? Let's see the data in a visualized way to better understand them. I have a neighborgram ready for you here. So this is a visualization that we have from Edge. So I had in my assets, in my technical assets, an application called Java. And this application transformed data from Greece to Norway by delivering a report there, by creating as an output a report, and was giving it to a Norwegian firm. So all the input that was in this application, all the input in this application find themselves in this situated process too. Indeed, I can see that I have the customer name here. So let me go back, let me leave this visualization and go back and examine again the data that created the visualization. As we saw, we have a situated process that transmitted data from Greece to Norway. This involved a Java application, and we can navigate and see what are the input columns in this Java application. Here you see that customer name and trace are encrypted, but that is why I didn't put the encryption method on the data level, because they might be encrypted in this application, but might not be encrypted in another one. And let me go back. Sorry. So we had locations. We said that this situated process transferred data from Greece to Norway. These locations are not plain strings. These locations are taken from control vocabularies. So you cannot type it differently every time or type it wrong. Control vocabularies are also about things and relationships, rich structures on their own right. We must know, for example, that the specific country belongs to Europe and European Union. Only certain things have certain relationships, and control vocabularies allow us to have these things right. That way we can have integration and information discovery. Let me go back to my situated process. And so I have all the information I need now for compliance for these elements. I have married the bottom-up approach, starting from the data, and the top-down approach, starting from the business processes. I know all my data, which ones are PII, where does it flow, and who is accessing it and where. That gives me everything I need to know to define my obligations and permissions under condition based on the GDPR directive. In TopBraid Edge, we have gone a step further, and we have created a knowledge-based engine that, based on this structured information, it identifies automatically your obligations and GDPR permissions and the forms and the documents that you might need. And let's see what this is all about. I will run my knowledge-based engine. I see that it creates 222 new information items, and I will go back to my situated process to see what has happened. Okay, so before we were examining this transmission of customer name outside EU, I see many more situated process, but I will come back to that. Let's see what the knowledge base engine did to that particular situated process that we had before. Before we had 4 information items, but now we have one more that says that my situated process is subject to these specific obligations and permissions under GDPR. Of course, as everything in our product, you can navigate and see more information around it. For example, we see that for this obligation, this is the obligation for consent. This is stipulated by paragraph 7 of the GDPR directive, and you can navigate and see what is the body of this paragraph, and you can also navigate to paragraphs and articles. And you can also see, for example, what is the required resources to be compliant for this obligation. For example, what are the procedures that you should follow when you have transfers to third countries, or forms that you might need. For example, this is the form that has to be signed by the data subject to give consent. And you can download it from here and just use the form. Yeah, accept the risk. Okay. Let's see that in a visualized way again. I have it here ready for you in a visualized way. So this was my Java application, and this is now the fact that it's subject to these permissions, the information that we didn't have before the knowledge engine ran. And these are the documents, and this is that where it's stipulated. It's stipulated from paragraph 7, article 7, which is in chapter 2 in the GDPR directive. We provide the directive in our product in a structured way also. Okay, so let's see what are the new situated processes that were created from my knowledge-based engine. Let's pick one. So this knowledge-based engine, when I run it, I noticed that there were more situated processes created because the engine crawled the knowledge graph, the interconnected information, and identified that our customer name column belonged to a database that was hosted on a server. And this server was outside the EU, was hosted in US. So the engine discovered the obligations that should be considered from the data protection officer. Again, we have the data here, but I have the visualization ready, so maybe you understand it better. So this is my relational database, and this is all the tables that are input in this database. So all the columns that are input, this is my column that are input in these tables, they also found themselves in the same situation. So this is the relational database that is hosted on the server outside EU. This knowledge-based engine is actually a set of rules that run on structured interconnected data. And these rules are written with, we wrote them with OpenW3C standards, and you can see them and change them and tailor them to your own business needs. Based on this interconnected information, the knowledge graph, you can search for any kind of information. For example, I can search and see which are the columns, which are the database columns that I have marked as PII. So I can go and say, give me all the PII ones that have criticality medium. Search, okay, and I can also have them as a CSV. I can download them as CSV. Okay, so let's summarize what we saw today. First, we saw how to use TopBraid EDG as a data governance environment. And then we saw how to capture the business and data processes and metadata around them. And finally, we described how our knowledge-based engine crawl this data to identify the GDPR obligations. And that was all from me. Jack, you can have the screen back.
All right. Thanks very much, Natasha. Natasha's responsible actually for building the GDPR extensions to Edge and the knowledge engine that she just demonstrated for you. So to summarize, she's shown you how TopBraid EDG brings a knowledge base to go beyond identifying PII, although it did that too, but to answer complex questions like these. Who are my data partners? What countries are they in? What jurisdictions have regulatory authority? And do I have any assets in my systems associated with those countries? These are complex, and ultimately, questions like these show that GDPR compliance is really about connecting the dots for governance and control of personal data. And I want to emphasize that this idea of using graph technology to connect the dots is not just based on our perspective alone. Graph-based data representations emphasizing relationships have matured in highly visible solutions to hard problems. Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, and PayPal all use their own implementations of graph technologies. And especially in the challenging financial regulatory sphere, the Enterprise Data Management Council has taken a strong position that semantic engineering and graph technologies offer a solution for the mandated governance infrastructure and quality requirements. And as you can see here, GDPR is among these challenges. This knowledge base allows us to capture the meaning, to understand how critical aspects of various enterprise contexts relate to your compliance activities. Here you can see finally the pre-built models that GDPR speeds the capture of organization-specific knowledge that's needed for GDPR compliance. TopBraid EDG helps to automate compliance because the knowledge engine can apply rules that help automate a variety of required activities and assessments. And Christy, I think we have a final quick poll.
Yes, we do. Jack, if you'll go ahead and share that poll, that would be great. This is the last polling question that we'll ask. Thank you all for participating in these polls. We'd just like to know what your biggest challenges are in becoming GDPR compliant. So you can select one or more of the following. Is it understanding GDPR, addressing the many use cases needed to comply, planning for the roles, people, tasks, processes needed, evaluating and implementing technology or systems, or deploying solutions that enable data protection by design. So if we'll just give another couple of seconds and let folks finish responding. All right, Jack, if you want to go ahead and close out that poll, we can take a look. Okay, it looks like it's a good many of you are looking to deploy, or the challenges of deploying solutions that enable data protection by design, also addressing many use cases and planning for the roles, people, and tasks needed. So very good. Thank you for taking our polls today. Jack, I'll let you go from here.
Great, Christy. We've shared quite a bit about the details of personal data protection, and I want to close today's webinar with a broader perspective. Article 25 of the GDPR, data protection by design and default, requires something quite a bit larger, and I've excerpted several of the key points here. It requires governance. Article 25 requires controllers specifically to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. Natasha demonstrated that TopBraid Enterprise Data Governance provides such measures. EDG handles compliance cases like these because it's not just a tool. It's a complete pre-built semantic data governance framework. EDG models, features, and capabilities provide the coverage, the flexibility, and the insight needed for governing effective GDPR compliance programs. EDG handles compliance cases like these because it's not just a tool. We agree with the Enterprise Data Management Council and the many successful initiatives finding that complex data problems like GDPR can be solved using semantic engineering and an infrastructure that's built on graph representation. How do we provide these capabilities in EDG? TopBraid EDG uses the simple notion of assets that Natasha introduced to capture and organize diverse enterprise metadata, including the tagging of personally identifiable information, but much, much more. Edge maps the diversity of your organization's information assets to this rich, standardized data model. These mappings organize your information conveniently to help you build your unique compliance program. And because each compliance program is unique, mappings can be easily extended or customized as needed with the packages you see on the left. You've seen just a few of TopBraid Edge's features. Beyond what you've seen, there's a rich feature set with collaboration, audit and change control, notifications, workflow management, data quality controls. There's a lot here that we're not going to be able to go into. And they support a broad range of use cases in governance and compliance. And I'm going to mention just one overarching capability in closing because it's so important. With so much focus on what's inside, you might wonder, will Edge be yet another silo? TopBraid products are designed from the ground up to integrate with other business systems. This is a complex slide, and I don't expect you to read it all. I'm showing this simply to share that everything that you've seen in TopBraid Edge is not only available in the user interface. Edge is designed to specifically distribute information saved in a central repository that you see in red in the center of your screen. What we call Edge is actually just a user interface onto that repository. The TopBraid Live server enables this repository to share data in a variety of different common inputs and outputs formats, and all of the data is available for bulk import and export. It can be made available in real time as well through web services. So I'm not going to go into any more details here. Please contact us. We can explore how best to support your environment and needs. Summarizing the benefits that support GDPR compliance programs, TopBraid Edge is a full data governance framework. It offers flexibility and extensibility because of semantic standards. We can talk about any types of things and relationships that are needed. We can connect your PII and regulated activities with policies and enforcement. And because of graph technologies, Edge can map anything to anything. Finally, Edge minimizes what you have to understand, design, and create because pre-built enterprise and regulatory compliance models reduce the cost and speed your compliance. Understanding your GDPR exposures and compliance status, connections make this possible and enable complex queries for meaningful insight. That pretty much finishes what we have to share today about semantic data governance for GDPR in Edge. And I'll turn the podium back to you, Christy, and you can manage our question and answer session.
Great, thank you, Jack. If you haven't already, please go ahead and submit your questions and discussion points in the question box located on the right-hand side control panel. I see we have a few questions already coming in, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, here's a question. I think this will be for you, Natasha. You have shown support for the management of several types of information elements and their connections needed to address GDPR. But how does the data get into your governance environment? Natasha, can you take that?
Yes, Christy. So if you already use TopBraid Edge for data governance, then most of the information is already in the environment and you just need to annotate certain information as PII. Actually, this is what I did for the demo. I put all the data that I wanted to annotate in a CSV, so I don't have to put it one by one, and I just imported the CSV. Let me show you how. Just to show you, I will create a new compliance asset and call it demo. Okay, and I will import based on some standard templates that we provide. Okay, 87 triples. And I can go into the production copy and I see my data elements. And they are marked as PII immediately. In Edge, we do some data profiling and reasoning that can be applied to identify which data elements contain personal information, for example, email address. However, this approach cannot be complete or fully reliable. involvement of subject matters, I think it's required. If you haven't used though Edge before, when you actually now start to use a data governance tool, then the information will either be auto-discovered directly from data sources or imported from other available systems. Edge supports a number of ways to bring information into its environment. It has importers from JDBC, it has importers from DDL files to bring in data dictionaries from various databases, and we also have integration with external tools that crawl, store procedures and data transformation and their input and outputs. In general, our product's strongest point is its integration capabilities, as Jaco has already told you. And in many projects, they have used Edge exactly as an integration environment between all the other systems. Jack, maybe you should show again the slide with the web services with Edge in the middle.
Sure, I can do that. Just a moment, Natasha. I think this is the slide you're referring to?
Yes, yes.
Right, so yeah, here you can see that all of the integrations Natasha was just discussing. I'm wondering, actually, Natasha, there's another point here. If I could speak for just a moment. It's great that you've addressed these options for having or getting the data into the system for GDPR. But I just want to note that some of you in the audience, beyond the actual question there, might be thinking about an even larger, more core question that we often hear speaking with our customers. And it goes something like this. Well, how can I even find the information in my organization that we need to collect and identify as being relevant to GDPR in order to bring it into TopBraid Edge in the first place? The importers are fine, but how do you get to all of this? Certainly, this is every organization's unique challenge and responsibility. As with every data governance challenge, which GDPR compliance certainly is, a combination of people, processes, and technical tools or systems of support are needed. We've shown you how TopBraid Edge provides comprehensive data governance capabilities and specific structured knowledge models for addressing GDPR compliance. But beyond that, identification and capture of the information needed requires collaboration and social networking types of communication and processes within organizations. We weren't able to show you this today, but TopBraid Edge does provide many capabilities for collaboration, including team comments, task assignments, and a RACI responsibility, accountability matrix for notifications. And these collaboration tools allow and actually encourage the people most familiar with the data to participate in these processes and help drive the identification and collection. We're also exploring on a research basis, they're on our roadmap, and we're currently looking at automated technologies as well as modern social construction methods that'll allow Edge to drive what we might call the crowdsourcing of the sorts of knowledge that already exists in your organization. So I think that's plenty. I'm going to be quiet now and we'll give it back to you, Christy.
Thank you, Jack. Okay, let's take the next question. Here we go. Do you use Shackle for data validation? I guess, Natasha, that would be you as well.
Okay. Let me first explain, though, what Shackle is for people that they don't know it. Shackle is a W3C data modeling language that enables you to define constraints on your data. So whenever they are used in an application, you can control the quality of your data based on a standardized model and not with procedural code. These Shackle constraints can also be used to drive the user interface. In Edge, we are using Shackle to describe which properties go with which classes. That drives the user input forms. And let's see an example again in data assets. Go to a production copy of one. So let's pick a database column, for example. The properties that are available for this class, the database column class, all these properties that might be available are actually defined as constraints on this shackle constraints on this class. And as you see, they appear also in the user interface. For example, the PII property that we saw before, this is defined as a constraint in the database column, that the database column can have at least one true PII information. Okay, the blue lines that you see here are actually shackle groups. They are used to group a little bit the shackle constraints. So the same constraints, though, that we use to describe the classes, and the same constraints that automatically drive the UI, the same constraints can also be used for data validation. So at any point, for example, in my dataset, I can run a report and see if I have any violations. Let's try this one. Let's try to have a constraint violation report to see if we have any violations in this data set. And indeed we do. Here it says, for example, that my database column A is column of something, but this something should be an instance of a table. And we also have suggestions how to fix these violations. Since usually in EDGE, as we said, the data are coming from a variety of data sources, it's very important, especially for integration projects, and we use heavily Shackle for that as a way to control and check all the data that are being imported in our environment. Let me show you how you use Shackle in one of our importers. Okay, it's a lineage model. Okay, so if you see here in our importers, we first want to validate and then import, or just validate the important data. And let's try that to see how it goes. I try to import something. And I don't know, I hope we'll have some violations here just to show you. For example, here it says that this was a CSV, but in the first row, although it is a relational database, the dataset type, it's not table view or synonym, for example. This is how you check the quality of data and raise warnings of violations. It's a big issue. Shackle is a whole new subject on its own. I think we have a webinar of that. Maybe Christy will tell you what the webinar is and when that is.
Yes,
Christy?
I'll do that. Yes, I'll do that. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end. I just thought we might squeeze one more question in if it's possible. I know we're getting close on time. How about how can EDGE help in cases of data breaches? Can we address that question?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Natasha.
Okay, if you do I share my screen? Okay.
I think it's coming your way. Yeah. There we go.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, based on this interconnected data, we can trace everything from a potential breach. Let me show you an example with the lineage models that we saw before, with the importers. And let's suppose, let me first go into a lineage model and tell you what a lineage model is all about. So let's see it with a lineage gram. Lineage gram is a way to visualization for a lineage model where in the middle, we have all the software executables, the transformation, all the store procedures. On our left, we have all the inputs in these software executables. These inputs can be databases, data set elements, or whatever. On the right, we always have the outputs of the software executable, and the blue column here is the reports that the information assets that might come from these outputs. So if we have a data breach in a database, for example, let's say we had a data breach in this customer table, we can see everything. We can see all the software executables that have that as an input, and we can see where all these data were fed. And it can also work downstream. For example, I can I can have a breach in a report, and then I can see in my report what are the data that has been fed, because for all this data, the data protection officer has to become aware what are the data that were involved in that breach in order to create a report to deliver to the supervisor authorities in time, in the 70 hours time frame. I hope that covered it a bit, Christy?
Yep, I think that's great because we're getting really close on time. So let's go ahead and end the questions for today. And Jack, did you want to cover a summary?
No, I think everybody's really heard that. This is the same thing I spoke to previously, so maybe we can just put the wrap-up slide.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Jack. And I think Natasha had mentioned this just a couple of minutes ago. We are going to do an overview of Shackle webinar. That will take place next Tuesday at 11 Eastern time, and there's a link here if you want to register. You can also go to the homepage, topquadrant.com, and at the top, one of our sliders will direct you there as well. So if you are interested in learning more about Shackle, we encourage you to sign up for that webinar. Our CEO, Irene Polikoff, will be hosting that webinar. So I think we did have several questions that we were not able to get to. We will be answering those questions in the form of an email response to all attendees, so be on the lookout for that. We'll also be providing a link to the recorded presentation as well as the slides, so that will come to you via email as well. We certainly hope you found today's information valuable, and we thank you for your attention and participation, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.